أذكر الأيام يا حلو الهوى في حنايا الغاب عند الجدول حين كنا والهوى حلو الهوى نتشاكى في حنين القبل ضمنا الليل على بوح طوى كل ما في قلبنا من غزل فأنا إن أشتكي مر النوى لا تلمني يا حبيبي ينتهي اذكريني كلما الفجر بدا واذكري الأيام ليل السهر اذكريني كلما الطير شدا واحكي للغابة ضوء القمر اذكريني واذكري عهد الهنا أترى عشت إذا لم تذكري نحن جمعنا من الليل الغنا وحكايات الجمال المزهر يا حبيبي هرب الليل بنا ومشيناها دروب الحلم فلهونا عند واحات الهنا وجلسنا في ظلال النغم يا صفا دنيا من الورد لنا وعشيات خفاف النسم نتهادى والغنى طائر في كل روض يغتني
Welcome to the program Syria, 10 Years of Violent Conflict. My name is Msf Go and I will be your moderator tonight. And this program tonight is a collaboration by De Balie and Médecins sans Frontières, in Dutch also known as Artsen zonder Grenzen. So what started in 2011 as a civilian protest against the dictatorial Assad regime culminated in a bloody conflict in which many parties joined, and which has led to the enormous suffering of the Syrian population. Nearly 13 million Syrians have been displaced, and more than 500,000 Syrians have been killed. And unfortunately, the hardship is far from over. So tonight, in full realization that an hour and a half is way too short to discuss 10 years of violent conflict, we would like to touch upon the following questions in order to provide you with insider stories to this conflict. So what has 10 years of war meant for the people, but also for the culture and the environment of Syria? And how have Médecins Sans Frontières, which I will call now MSF, how has they operated in a war in which the bombing of medical facilities was one of the main strategies by the regime? What is the current status of the country, and what are the prospects for the near future? So I will discuss this tonight with Sherwan Qasem from Médecins Sans Frontières. You were born in Syria, and you worked as a journalist in Damascus, and then you started working for MSF in Syria, then later in Turkey, and since 2017 you live in Amsterdam and still work for MSF. Puk Leenders is an operational manager for MSF, if I'm correct, and has amongst others been on missions to Syria. Correct. Nariman Hamo, welcome, is now an IT consultant based in Amsterdam, born in Syria, and you did a lot of work as a civil society activist, first in Syria, then in Turkey, then in Europe. And as a peace activist, you were specialized in, as I may call it, women's diplomacy. And we will hear much more about it later. And you already did hear some of the beautiful music by Esmail Branu and Anastasis Sarakatsanos, and I will introduce them later a bit more. But first, we were going to listen to a short introduction about violence against citizens from Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Ugur Üngör, whose most recent work is an archive on the dynamics and the violence of the Syrian civil war. Ugur Üngör.
Thank you very much, everybody. It is my task here to give a 10-minute overview of a war that has raged for 10 years. That is going to be impossible, of course, but I would like to lift out 4 elements of this conflict that I think are relevant and important in understanding its dynamic. And that is the escalation, the phases of the conflict, the segmentation of the country, second and third, the sub-processes ongoing during the conflict, and finally the forms of violence committed against civilians. So let's start with the first element, namely this is a conflict that has gone through several phases. So here you can see a number of important key moments in the course of the conflict, the bold periods here I have emphasized as the major turning points of the conflict, which started, of course, with a mass contestation of the rule of the Assad regime, and then gradually in the summer of 2011 to late 2011 became an armed conflict, first locally and then spreading across the country. As it moved north into the city of Aleppo, with the international involvement and the growth and development and anchoring of ISIS in Syria. And of course, since really 2018, 2019, in a deadlock and a stalemate in which really there are no winners in any war is the cliche, but here definitely we do not have any winners. Now, these phases of escalation are interesting in itself, but it also means, of course, that the country has been segmented. At some point during the conflict, the map looked as follows. Red, we had the Assad regime control, black ISIS, yellow, we had the YPG, the PYD, and in green, we had the rebels. Now, this map is often shown as a symbol of the segmentation of territorial control. But it's more than only territorial control and military control and the lines of governance in which the government of Assad, in one case, the fledgling state that the Islamic State wanted to be, or the PYD. It is more than that. It is also a segmentation into 4 parts of a country that has existed since 1946, into 4 distinct segments of the population, with 4 distinct narratives, 4 distinct political cultures that has seen profound polarization across time. So there are children born in the year 2010 in the red zone who have never spoken with anybody from the yellow zone. These children are now 10 years old, they're 11 years old. So this polarization and this segmentation of the country has done immense damage as the kind of unseen and almost imperceptive changes that were ongoing in Syria and that are still ongoing right now. A third important element are what the conflict actually means. So if we take a look at the entire conflict, then the most basic agreement that we have across these four segments is that we're dealing with a conflict that is at times a violent conflict. But within this violent conflict, we had an uprising that was overall non-violent, but that has overlaps or began to overlap or began to change and transform into an armed uprising, an insurgency against a government that was heavily armed. This confrontation turned into a civil war. Now, within this civil war, what does a civil war mean? It means military confrontation, it means battle, but it also means conflict against violence against civilians. And so within the conflict, within the revolution, within the violent conflict, we have a core element of the Syrian conflict that distinguishes it from many other conflicts in its biggest impacts on human lives, namely the violence against civilians. Very often we think, or people tend to think wrongly, that we're dealing with chaos. 10 years of chaos and people have not kept an overview of the conflict. But I think in thinking in terms of the escalations, the segmentation, and the sub-processes, we can actually make sense of it. I'm interested in violence against civilians. I'm interested in studying it and understanding it. Unfortunately, we have a lot of people who have suffered, civilians who have suffered violence against them, and we have a wide range of that violence. We have indiscriminate violence. We have the shelling, the barrel bombing, the chemical attacks, and sniping that went on at some point during the conflict, which was indiscriminate. Anybody who ended up in a crosshair of a sniper could be killed. The barrel bombs that went off in the Ghouta, eastern Damascus, or in eastern Aleppo did not distinguish between somebody who was against or for this or that fighting faction. So this violence was indiscriminate. A lot of people have suffered it. I have friends who have survived it. We also have targeted violence. We have very specific, group-specific violence against particular groups and individuals, such as massacres against particular neighborhoods. In Homs in 2012, we saw a string of massacres against particular neighborhoods for their sectarian identity overall and their geographic identity. We have seen individual executions of persons who considered in dissent against this or that faction. Some of these executions were videotaped, as you well remember. We have hunger as a very particular form of violence against civilians. The targeted violence also targeted particular categories. Doctors, we will hear about it later. Lawyers have suffered particular forms of intimidation and violence. Reporters, there are a large number of civilian journalists and even foreign journalists who have been killed in this conflict for being journalists. Children have been targeted specifically. Conscientious objectors who refuse to fight for one or the other faction have been suffering in prisons and have suffered violence. Women are a particular target of all of these four fighting factions. So when we look at this kaleidoscope of violence, of torture, beatings, hangings, sexual violence, forced disappearances, and of course, most lately also demographic engineering or ethnic cleansing, as it used to be called, all of these forms of violence have made the most profound impact on Syrians. And I think it's important to document it, to research it, and to teach it, if not to think about transitional justice. So that's why I think it is important, among all the discussions, to centralize the violence against civilians as a key issue that made an impact in people's lives.
Thank you. To start with the civilians, the personal stories, I would like to start with Nariman and Sherwan. I was just thinking, because we're looking back at 10 years, but if we look back, Nariman, at 11 years ago, what was your life like? Where did you live? In what part of Syria? What was your day-to-day business?
Yeah, sure. Like first of all, I grow 10 years older, which is like a lot happened. I come from Afrin in a Kurdish area, and I lived in Aleppo, and I was doing my master's in AI. I studied IT, so my plan was to study robotics in Japan, where also I studied the language for that.
Oh,
so
wow.
it was a very different plan.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it had to change. So in 2012, me and my family, we decided that before it's too late, we want to move outside Aleppo, because operations started in the eastern, areas, and also in the countryside. So I moved to Turkey in 2012.
Okay, already.
And I was before also active in the Kurdish arena, but then in Turkey, we thought it's going to end fast. We thought we can maybe flee somewhere else, but then it was more complicated. So I found myself, joining a group of young Syrian people and founding this organization that we led to a bigger, network and a bigger organization. And I was working with the Syrian activists to, let's say, build and to learn about civil society. It was, for me, like the last few years were more like an intensive course. Like I was 23 or 24 when this started.
Yeah, and were you already active when you were also studying AI and learning Japanese? Were you already also in some, you say, Kurdish movements, or were you part also of the revolution, or was it?
Yes, like in the revolution, that it just started, and I was trying to more do like small things like helping, IDPs, etc. I didn't really go outside all the time, because it was a little bit, for me, for safety reasons, very difficult to do that. And that's why in Turkey I found myself that this is how I can pour my heart into helping the Syrian community.
So later we will dive more into all the work you did in Turkey. Sherwan, to start with you, what did your life look like 12 years ago?
Yeah, basically I was just freshly graduated. I studied in Damascus University English language, and I freshly started my career as a journalist, and I applied for master as a Nariman. I was planning to continue this master, and maybe after that to continue academic life. I was more or less pursuing a bit a career in journalism and media at that time. But everything changed, as Nariman said, also after the beginning of the Arab Spring. I mean, it started even before when it started in Syria. It started when actually it started there in Yemen, and in Tunisia, and after Tunisia, when it moved to Egypt, to Yemen, Libya, and then when it came to Syria. And I remember one of the milestones at that moment was like actually how the country, the neighbors became enemies. For example, I lived in Damascus in a neighborhood called Msf Go or Msf 86. It was actually one of the previous, how can you call it, settlements of pro-government and army officers who've been given piece of land as a prize for their loyalty. And it was close to the university, so it's quite cheap for students to study there. And I remember I lived there for like 5 years. We were super close. People were really nice. I remember, for example, I had a neighbor that had a small grocery shop downstairs, and I was taking care. Sometimes he will come to me. He will tell me, Sherwan, can you take off care of my shop till I go and take my daughter to the school? And I will, like he was trusting me with his money. Suddenly, as everything started, the fact that I'm from a Sunni background in that area that was more covered with a different kind of sectarian group, suddenly everything changed, and I was threatened, like many other neighbors, that I have to leave as soon as possible. So I left and I moved to another neighborhood in the outskirts of Damascus. And
What were you thinking? Did you have any imagination then already where this was heading to, or I mean?
To be honest, no one thought it will take 10 years.
No.
Not me, no any expert, I think, except actually, I think Koos van Dam. He was one of the famous Dutch experts. He's the only one who said for a long time, actually since 80s, he wrote a book and he said that this government or this regime will not be removed easily. But to be honest, all of us, we thought that things will come down in one way or another, and there will be some kind of agreement or a government and a regime change. But unfortunately, this didn't happen. And in 2012, at May, there was one of the biggest explosions happened in Damascus. There was a twin suicide bomb that attacked Palestine branch in Al-Qazaz area next to our university. And at that time, I remember me and my brother, we were preparing ourselves to go to the university, and the house was shaking, the windows were broken, and when we went to see, we only saw fire, smoke, dead bodies, and security forces. At that moment, me and my brother, we realized and we thought that maybe it's a time. Then disappearance of several friends and colleagues was the optimal and the absolute sign that the space is harder and we have to leave. I lived to northeast Syria, where I am from, and then I crossed to Turkey. And when, luckily, MSF entered my life, or I entered MSF at that moment.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask the question, but because we talk about this long time period, also for you, Nariman and Sherwan, can you tell us like one or two key defining moments, and they can be very personal or non-personal, but that were really defining for you, growing further in adulthood in these 10 years?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of moments. Like, first of all, I had to literally start my life twice from scratch. Yeah. Like in 2012, when I went to Turkey, I had to learn a new language. I had to start from almost nothing. And also in 2017, when it was I was no more able to operate from Turkey, because also it was difficult to have a residency, also a work permit. We tried very hard, me and my colleagues, to do that. So it became also difficult. And I was also 30 years old, so I was fed up with all of what happened, because it is really consuming to work on a conflict when you are an activist and you're just passionate about it. So these two life events, and of course a couple of more, when I heard my house was destroyed during some of the bombing events, and also the first time I was in Geneva in 2013. I worked for 5 years after that in Turkey, but since 2013, which was my first, immediate interact with the special envoy and all of what's happening about the Syrian peace talks, I thought, these people don't know what's happening. We expect people to know, and that it's normal that people know what's happening in Syria, and justice should happen. But it was very shocking to me that how complicated and how let's say useless the system is.
What did you figure out was the biggest misconception about then the conflict in Syria that you discovered?
It's not even we expect people to know that people are suffering and there are violations being committed on the ground, and that civil society and women should be there, all these people from UN and also representative of countries. And what I heard is questions and homework for us as civil activists. They know all the scenarios, they know all the techniques, and they have experts, more than us, because we were just learning. I was learning by doing to change in Syria, but also to learn how to build these organizations, etc. So it was shocking to me that they kind of pushed back and gave us more homework to do, to say, for example, how can civil society be on the table or in the peace talks. So it was painful, also very painful and shocking, and for me, let's say, frankly speaking, it was also traumatizing. It's disappointing also, So it was a lot of it needed a lot of control, pain control, also anger management to deal with that. And also to think of if this is the case, how can I then, be the voice of what's happening in Syria, and how can we really make the change and reach to a political transition in Syria towards like more peaceful and to end this conflict. So that made my job and my colleagues' job way harder than we expected.
Yeah, clear. Yeah. And for you, Sherwan, what was a defining moment for you?
I think there were like several defining moments, but I will try to summarize them to two or to three. I think the first one, as Nariman said, actually, the facts that you have to leave your house, the facts that you became a foreigner, you have no bed, you have no house anymore. In Syria, when even I moved from my hometown to Damascus to start my study, it was a bit difficult at the beginning. I felt actually, to be honest, I was really, when I moved to study in Damascus in 2006, I was crying every day, missing my mom. I was like mom spoiled older boy, and I remember even one day I was speaking to my mom in a very loud voice in one of the public phones, and one old guy came from behind and told me, "My son, I'm sorry for your loss. May he rest or she rest in peace." Who died? You know, I was just
homesick.
I was just telling mom exactly. I was just telling mom that I miss her, and this was difficult, you know, like to start everything far from beginning. But still in Damascus, it was difficult. But you didn't need a residency permit. You didn't need a piece of paper. You didn't need to renew your passport every 2 years. And in Syria now we have the most expensive passport in the world. It cost $825, and it only lasts for 2 years. And it can take you to only 17 countries. Majority of them are islands, in like a Seychelles Island or Mauritius. I don't think any Syrian will prefer to go to Mauritius for a holiday. So this was one. The other one was actually losing several friends. I have two friends who studied together in Damascus University, Kaniwar Mallah Ali and Znar Osman. They were like, we studied together in Damascus University, and one of them died in Ras Al Ain in an airstrike in 2013, and the other died in a suicide bomb attack in Derek in 2014, leaving a pregnant wife behind and a lot of broken hearts. But the biggest moment was for me, actually, to be honest, losing my father. I worked as a humanitarian worker in Syria, in North Syria, from east to west in the period between 2012 until today, actually, and to increase and expand the access to medical care for people. But my father fell down from the roof in September 2018 while he was trying to prepare the roof for the winter that is coming. And when he fell down, of course, there are no ambulances or a decent kind of ambulances. They took him with a truck to the state hospital that in Qamishli city, where actually the city is divided between government and the Kurds. And of course, crossing 8 checkpoints till he arrived there, a lot of internal bleeding and no intensive care units beds available. We start looking again, or actually my uncles and my aunts start looking again for another hospital. Private sector, they have no intensive care unit, but they keep him in one of the emergency rooms for like a whole day till one person died in the national hospital. And we paid the guard to lay down in the bed, to book the bed for my father. But my father arrived, was referred to the hospital, and after like 2 to 3 days, he passed away. He couldn't survive. So it was a bit heartbreaking for me, but at the same time, it was actually ensuring and making me even more into working with Doctors Without Borders related to this. The last thing, after his death, it didn't end because he wanted to be buried next to his parents. And our village is on the Turkish border directly. When they took his dead body to be buried in the cemetery, the Turkish soldiers started shooting at them, and they didn't allow them to bury the body. So they had to take his body to another cemetery, and he's even for eternity or till the situation change in the country has to lay down in another cemetery away from his parents' body. So this was one of the biggest things. And to be honest, 2 years ago, after his death, and my mom stayed alone, I was not even sure that I can sit in front of people and I can share this story without actually collapsing or losing my conscience. Yeah.
Well, thank you then for sharing it now, but I'll keep it here for now.
Okay,
yeah?
Thank you. No, it's okay.
Hearing all these personal stories, part of your research is our archives of the personal testimonies, if I'm correct. Why is it so important, and how do you archive them, and what kind of structure to tell what kind of story?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial to document as much as possible of the personal testimonies of ordinary people in Syria, For several reasons. I mean, first of all, because we've had a country that last year was 50 years under the rule of a regime so authoritarian that even academic experts could only write one book about it. Because once you had written that one book, you would be banned from getting access to the country. And so we don't really have a proper social history of this country. You know, so what did it mean to be Syrian, for example? We don't really know. And we don't know because of the strict censorship. That was this half century, and this kind of the fear that people had for telling even ordinary stories, not even necessarily related to violence of the regime, like in this example, but the deprivation. So for the sake of truth seeking, in general, it was already important, and in particular when it comes to this conflict, the Syrian catastrophe is not only the story of a small country in the Middle East that collapsed in a civil war. But it actually says, these ordinary stories of Syrians, they say a lot about the human condition in general.
What do they tell you already? What do they say to you?
What do they tell
you?
For example, what does it mean, or how does it feel as a child to be told that the intelligence is always listening and the walls have ears?
Yeah.
What does it do to a child to grow up like that? What does it do, for example, to people who had a loved one disappear in the gulag of the regime's prisons, and to not be able to ask, forget about accountability, but not even being able to ask for where the person is at all. So the impact that all of this violence has on a society is something that is, to a large extent, not unprecedented. We also had it in the Soviet Union or North Korea. These are also conditions that are terrible. But they teach us a lot about how human beings survive. And how resilient they can be, but also how humans can turn to violence, for example, how they can reach for weapons to take revenge, for example. These stories also I've heard a lot from ordinary Syrians.
Yeah, and last question for now: how do you work? Like, how do you get these testimonies?
Well, through talking to people, of course, by trying to be open and listening to the broadest spectrum of individuals that you can find.
Yeah, who's your focus group? Is it here in the Netherlands, or is it in Lebanon and Turkey, or even still in Syria? Like who?
I actually once started on the Turkish-Syrian border.
Yeah,
because that's where the first refugees, of course, had poured into.
Yeah.
But then at some point, in 2015-16, I didn't have to go there anymore because they came here.
Yeah.
So I could just go around my neighborhood and just befriend people or make acquaintance with people and see if they would be interested in telling their stories. And very often they are, because it's often also a relief for a lot of Syrians to tell their stories, because finally somebody is listening to them.
And you showed us this fragmentation of the country, and also how, the fragmentation of the population. Is it something that is also important in your research? So, for example, do you think like, I still haven't spoke to a lot of pro-Assad people because most of them are maybe still there? How does that work out in your research, or is it not important for this human condition?
Yeah, I think that if you depart from these forms of violence against civilians, I mean, one has to talk, obviously, to most of the survivors of that violence. Yeah. So, for example, former detainees, for example, people who have survived the siege, people who, for example, were survivors of particular massacres. And very often those people are from a particular segment of Syrian society. Yeah. But I think it's very important to talk to everybody. Yeah. For example, why did someone join ISIS? That's also a very important question to ask. Yeah. Right? So, as broadly as possible, because this is not only the catastrophe and a tragedy of one color of that fourth segmentation in Syria, but the entire country.
Yeah. Well, and you will take it for granted that you will never be allowed into the country, as you just told, because after one book, you're done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We're now going to go to the music. Welcome. Ismael. Do I say it now? Nawi. And Anastasios. There's a very beautiful story also behind your music. Ismael, you're originally from Raqqa, and in the end you fled to the Netherlands, crossing a lot of borders. In what way did this influence your music?
So yeah, like on my way, I had to go to Greece. I had to go to Turkey, and there I have met a lot of musicians, and I have played with like a lot of musicians, and that really actually inspired me to continue with this. And and now like I ended up in the Code Arts.
In Rotterdam.
Yeah. And like it's still actually going on, and we are working as well like on like new stuff because of like I really don't know what to say, to be honest.
Okay, it's okay. We just have to listen to the music.
But like actually I just want to say thank you so much for sharing the stories, and I feel them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. يا فجري لما طل ملون بلون الفل، يا فجري لما طل ملون بلون الفل، صحي عيون الكون محبوبي قبل الكل، يا فجري لما طل ملون بلون الفل، يا فجري لما طل ملون بلون الفل، صحي عيون الكون محبوبي قبل الكل. بالحي لما تدور بدك مشاعل نور، بالحي لما تدور بدك مشاعل نور، منزل حبيبي زور يا فجري قبل الكل، منزل حبيبي زور يا فجري قبل الكل، صحي عيون الكون محبوبي قبل الكل، محبوبي قبل الكل، يا فجري لما طل ملون بلون الفل، يا فجري لما طل ملون بلون الفل، صحي عيون الكون محبوبي قبل الكل، محبوبي قبل الكل. يا فجري ليل النور طول على المجروح، روح لي حبيبي روح يا فجري قبل الكل.
للكل روح لي حبيبي روح يا فجر يا قبل الكل صحي عيون الكون محبوبي قبل الكل محبوبي قبل الكل
Puk Leenders, you have been involved with Syria for MSF. When was the first time you went to Syria, and what was your exact task?
So in 2014-15, I was around Syria. So I worked in Iraq and Turkey, responding on the refugee, the developing refugee crisis, where people fled, so informal and informal camps. But around at the end of 2015-16, that was the first time I was in Syria. And as MSF, we have been starting already operations since the beginning of the.
Where did MSF enter? Like when this all started, and what was the strategy?
So for MSF, since the beginning of the conflict, we have tried to set up operations and to respond on the immediate medical and humanitarian needs we saw, but it has been incredibly hard. One of the main challenges from our perspective is for MSF is that we have multiple times requested access and registration from the government of Syria in order to work in their controlled areas, which we are unfortunately not able to get.
You were not allowed to get into the controlled area by the government?
Correct.
Okay. Because I've heard that there is also a lot of criticism on international aid, which was only allowed into the territories by the government and wasn't going to their territories by the opposition. But for MSF, it was the other way around, actually.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
But so you could get into the parts that were controlled by the opposition forces, or also
at times, depending on the situation and the security. So yes. So mainly we have been operating in the northern parts of Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, in the beginning, and we've tried with multiple donations and to respond. And mainly, for me personally, I've mainly worked inside the northeast because that was accessible. So for me, it was around the first time I was there was around the offensive of Manbij and Kobane, Ain Arab.
Yeah. So, for example, I mean, here in the West, we have seen all these images from Aleppo, for example. Could MSF go into Aleppo, or was it out of the question?
So at times we have been accessing there.
Okay,
I'm sure Sherwan can tell a bit about that.
Yeah.
So certain areas we were able to access, but I mean, depending on the situation at that moment. It was really hard to set up operations and.
Well, what I think, if I'm correct, what was really difficult was that, first of all, it was even criminalized, if I understood correct, by the government to go to seek medical assistance within, territory by the opposition. So it was very dangerous. Is that correct? Yeah.
So basically, actually, from government side, they are not big fan of MSF or any aid that is not operating the government control area. The government condition is that you have to work in collaboration with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and there are a lot of conditions that will harm our neutrality and impartiality, and also it will make it very difficult to be in the areas. I mean, one of the main criteria for MSF is the medical need. So we have to define the area we are working upon the medical need that we see in the area. And the government, on that side also, on the other hand, the government of Syria also considered any aid, or actually called us smugglers without borders, because we are not going, or we are not crossing through Damascus, because we are going through Turkey, through Iraqi Kurdistan, through Jordan and other
but they
corridors.
but they also didn't allow you to go through Damascus, right? So it was made impossible, actually.
If you listen to the stories, more than 12 million people being displaced multiple times, and you would expect a massive response from the humanitarian community, and we have been having those access challenges until the day of today, and I think the situation from then until now is still very there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there was this other gruesome strategy by the regime to actually really explicitly target medical facilities. I mean, we've all seen the images here. Maybe Ugur can tell us also a little bit more about this. Like, was this something unique for Syria, or does this always happen within a civilian, within a war?
Well, when you have a war between two countries or a civil war within a country, medical neutrality is one of the more important principles, of course, that you should be respecting. But of all the conflicts or civil wars that I've studied, I think there are very few, if any, examples of a government of all parties so systematically attacking medical facilities, not only through the bombing of hospitals, but also through the targeted chasing of doctors who they suspect have helped one demonstrator who was shot in his arm in a field hospital, for example.
On this personal level, it went on.
It is that rabid and with such a single-minded radicalism to chase after the medical community. It really is something absolutely unique, I think, in the history of violence, not only in terms of attacking those areas that are under opposition control, but also the way that the Assad regime has militarized medical facilities in its own control, and has transformed these hospitals into killing centers. We have seen the Caesar photos, for example, right? They're related to Hospital 601 in Damascus. So that is also unique, how medical this conflict is.
Yeah. So it became dangerous to seek medical assistance as civilians.
Yes, absolutely. There were doctors, for example, who went from opposition-held territory into regime-held territory and silenced their identities, for example. If they were asked whether they were doctors, they would say, no, I'm not a doctor. I have nothing to do with it. Because if you were a doctor, then what were you doing in opposition territory? Are you maybe helping them? Are you maybe setting up a field hospital? So one of the more bizarrely most dangerous identity one could have in Syria is to be a doctor.
So what was the consequences, Puk and Sherwan, for your work?
So the consequences are that it has been to set up these hospitals. They were happening in very unconventional locations. Like we started a hospital in a chicken farm. We started hospitals in underground schools in order to treat people, war-wounded people who are children or other people who were victims from booby traps, who were put in their houses, but also separate from all the direct conflict-related medical needs. I mean, you also have still women delivering. You still have 10 years of war means as well that people are not being vaccinated. So you saw measles coming back, you saw polio coming back. And so next to all the war-wounded responses which were happening in these facilities, you also tried as much as we could to support with vaccinations, with primary healthcare, in order to respond.
But did you also set up new hospitals, right? But then you almost endangered also the doctors, who you asked to work for you. Was it sometimes a dilemma?
Working in the, I think the one thing I've learned while working in Syria is the immense resilience and and support. People are giving each other over and over and over again. And to be fair, the doctors around me and the nurses and all the other non-medical people supporting they were not thinking, they were doing. You see these people coming in. We were when we were running the hospital in the basement, for example, during the Manbij offensive, we saw a truck coming in and people were reporting us that by screaming that the truck would come in and you would get this nudge in your stomach because you have to open this truck and then you opened it and there were wounded, there were people who passed away. People were not thinking about themselves. People were thinking about what was happening around them.
So Sherwan, you said MSF found me. What made you? Why you wanted to work for this organization, and what did you do? What did you do in Syria? What did you do in Turkey?
Yeah, so basically, the first thing, why I said MSF found me, or I found MSF, actually I consider myself very lucky because I am in this sector. It's really not easy nowadays to be part of the Syrian conflict without taking a side. So you can be like your identity, your background, your religion background, your sectarian background, where you are from, all these are, they defined actually many people's which kind of political path they will be going. And if you are in from government control areas, or you are one of the minorities, or religious minorities, you will take the government side because the government side is the safest side for minorities, especially after the radicalization and the Islamization of the Syrian revolution, or what was called at that time the Syrian revolution, because later it's turned to a civil conflict, and now it's actually proxy war. So it's not a civil war anymore. Actually, many people are focusing on that, but I want to say. So the fact that my bread, the bread that daily I'm eating is coming from this sector is source of pride for me, and it's making me sleep properly at night. And I was in Turkey actually, and after I left Syria, I crossed to Turkey and I started working in a touristic agency. I was like a tourist guide. I spoke some Turkish, I spoke Kurdish, Arabic, English, a bit of Persian, and Assyriac. So I mean, all these languages. I mean, growing in Northeast Syria give you always all this kind of bilingual or trilingual or whatever you will call it. So I could find a job, and it was actually not bad to hang out with Gulf like Emiratis or Qataris tourists in Istanbul, till the moment, as I said, in Ras Al Ain in 2012, when my friend was killed in an airstrike. Later on, one of my closest friends, also Alan, was hit with a sniper, and he was bleeding for hours in Damascus countryside in Daraya, near Daraya. So this was a sign for me. And then I met by accident, and a friend of mine actually advised me that MSF is looking for translators. Then I met them. I did a very short interview, and without even realizing, I just quit in 24 hours, and I was in a bus heading from Istanbul to the border. It was really not easy to work, because when you are a national staff, or what we call, because we have different categories. One of the beautiful things in MSF that we have what we call local staff, national staff, international staff, people like me and Puk actually, before even meeting each other and working together in the same branch, because at that time I used to work for MSF Spain. Actually, we had only 100 kilometers between us, and sometimes in Kobane response, we were actually working in the same area without even seeing each other. So in that dynamic, it was really difficult to talk to those displaced people. I remember one day I was working in one of the hospitals in North Aleppo, and one of our nurses, his name was Usama, called me and he said, Sherwan, I want to take a break because my father is very sick and he's dying. And I told him, Usama, yesterday you were talking to your father. He said, yeah, but he was displaced 3 times. And he couldn't handle the 3rd displacement, so he died. Because of, I mean, they call it the broken heart syndrome, and it's something real. So we did our best to respond to this area, to all these needs in the area. But the problem was actually, when we talk about the Syrian conflict, Ugur can actually elaborate more on this. Every year, every stage is different than the other. So at the beginning, as Puk said, we could go with international staff to everywhere. We could meet people, we could talk to them, we could do actually, like we see on the photos behind us, we could do like direct distribution of non-food materials, we could do medical distribution, we could support medical facilities and all of that. But unfortunately, later with the radicalization of the groups and the fragmentation of the armed groups in the area, it was really difficult to know who is in control. So it was really not safe. And the fact that you are from specific area, even though you have MSF logo, didn't protect us. us. A couple of times I was actually about to be detained just because I'm from a specific area and they wanted to exchange me. The armed groups, they wanted to exchange me with other kind of prisoners from the other side. So then MSF told me, please, Sherwan, you are not allowed to go physically inside anymore. You will stay in Turkey.
Was it then even safer for like an international Western staffer to go there than to you? Because
ironically, in several stages, I mean, even now, actually, Puk can go, for example, to northeast Syria, and she can provide medical care in the Kurdish control area. But I can't go to Kamishli because it's really not safe. I'm wanted for military service from not one site, from actually more than one site. And there are more and more reasons that will put my life in risk. And on other hand, we MSF developed at that time a model we call remote management. I'm really proud with this model because the trust that we had in our national staff allowed us to train them even more, and then to create this kind of, and of course the internet and the WhatsApp and the Skype and all these kind of communication tools made it easier for us to collaborate. They are inside, the others are outside, and then we could guarantee some kind of presence even in the areas that we couldn't be there.
Because now you're working even from a further distance, from Amsterdam. How is that to you, to work from here but still being involved in this area that is, of course, so close to you?
Yeah, actually, when I first moved here, my line manager, who I consider one of the best people in my life, I really send her a lot of greetings from here, Kalina Klayer. She told me, Sherwan, if it's emotionally heavy on you, just work on other countries. So for a short period, I was working on Somalia specifically, later on, so on other contexts. But I mean, it felt not correct. You know, like as I said, again, it's a pleasure, and it's not a pleasure. Sorry for using the word. Actually, it's more like some kind of. It's very amazing that I can be part of this conflict. I can support those population. As I said, my mom, my sister, my brother are still in Syria, even though that we are like, I mean, me and two of my brothers, we are in Europe. I have two brothers in Germany, and myself here in the Netherlands, luckily because of my work with MSF. But, you know, like we have the majority of our friends, family members and neighbors who are still there. And we need to support them to be able to, you know, like, because they are, the people who are inside right now, they are the vulnerables among the vulnerables, who are the ones who refused at the beginning to leave, or they didn't have even that $100 price of a ticket to cross to Turkey, and then maybe to try to cross using one of these boats to cross to Greece, and then to find their way to a better future. So it's very important that we are doing our job to help those people to stay and to keep and preserve their dignity. One of the most important things in the humanitarian work, I took a lot of time, sorry, but is the dignity of the people. Because if you have no medication, you will lose your dignity and maybe your life. If you have no food, and if you have no, so your basic needs. I mean, now, for example, the water is one of the biggest problem, actually. There is no drinking water in a lot of areas. And water, electricity, and a lot of services being used as a blackmailing tool, unfortunately.
Well, we go a little bit later also to the current situation. I wanted to go to Nariman and talk about what you were doing during the war, because you were an activist, but on a very diplomatic level. You said you organized within Turkey with a group of especially Syrian women. What was your main first objection? You know, what did you want to achieve? How did you roll into this role?
Let me share with you what I learned about survival first. Like, survival is beyond just surviving with your family or financially in Turkey and surviving all of the bombing, etc. For me, it was more like surviving my voice, you know, surviving the values that I represent, surviving my very existence. Because also dictatorship was all about raping that simply, you know, to be, simply the right to simply be or to exist. And that's where I think we started the revolution and we started the change in Syria, and then the political change was actually due to in Syria, and it was more a kind of an existence battle, let's say, and it was also again race against time, because we were trying to build the civil society, we were trying to build the Syrian human, you know, because before the revolution it was prohibited, it was not allowed for us to gather and to
what Ugur said,
it was not allowed. So we were learning and we were also trying to build the civil society. It was for us the tool to reach the peace, and it was the tool and the goal also. And what I did, actually, I not only worked on the track 1, and let me explain, like in the political process or peace process, there is this pyramid of 3 layers, 3 tracks. So what I did with a group of Syrian young people, we started an organization. So we did a lot of educating and awareness and capacity building on the track 3, which is the grassroots level, with lots of Syrian activists that at the beginning we were able to do workshops inside, in Turkey. People were crossing the border. Sometimes they were shot on the border, so we had to deal with that. It was very complicated. And we tried also to expand and to also train people to do these trainings and workshops inside Syria. And it was mostly about leadership, messaging, and citizen journalism and transitional justice. So we wanted to educate and make people aware about civil society and peace and the conflict. And on the track 2, which is more like the NGOs and institution, media and education, and NGOs like us, we worked on more also networking at that level, and also educating that level. So we were also trying to do some capacity building and networking, and we were successful to build like huge networks for peace resources, for women activists, and also for civil society organization. We did also trainings for organizational development. It was needed to also learn and pass that knowledge about how to organize, about governance, about networking, and then.
And so you said the knowledge was going back to Syria. So the activists were coming to Turkey and still were going back.
Like we started with a small training, and then we developed these programs and offices inside Syria, and it was also different along the time. At the beginning, we started with an office in Qamishli. Then we for the first couple of years they were also in Aleppo and Idlib, where there was it was possible to move around and to do some workshop, but when ISIS took over at some place, and when there was more Jabhat al-Nusra, and there was some bombing from the regime, so it was difficult. We were doing a workshop or conducting a workshop in Jabal al-Zawiya, for example, and then people will be bombed, so they would cancel. So it was difficult also not only to cross the border to come to take the knowledge, but also to do it at some point. So it was, and that's what also kept me going, and so many people, seeing the pictures of my colleagues there, young people, smiling, and then after the last day of the workshop. So it was also amazing that we wanted to keep doing that, And
did you never get pessimistic that you were still working on, peace progress, prospect diplomacy, while there was this gruesome war going on?
Yes, like I said, the very first year when I was in Turkey, I went to Geneva, and I can tell you in a bit about the track 1 also negotiation, and it's more like we had to do something. We had to keep doing because of these people that are still under the bombing. We were also Syrian. It was not easy to live in Turkey and to work on a conflict, and it was emotional. Also, it was very consuming because we are not having a luxurious life also. But when you see people are still there, and they deserve that to know more and to be educated about civil society. They deserve to be part of the negotiation. Their voices should be on the negotiation table, and that's what kept me at least going. And that's what I brought, the message I brought several times to. We were doing these lobby trips to Geneva, we were literally told that women in civil society should not be on the table because it's already too complicated,
Really?
It started with the Annan 6 points in 2012, and then it was the Geneva communique that was the basis of all the peace talks that was under the umbrella of the United Nations. So in track 1, they were more the opposition and the regime, and a special envoy, and some powerful countries trying to, impact that. So we needed to analyze that. We had to learn how to deal with them, to lobby, and we were there as women and civil society representative. Every time there was a round in Geneva, we were never invited at the beginning. We did a lot of lobbying. We tried to put our own position papers about how diversity, how civil society, how women's rights, how minority issues should be addressed, how transitional justice should look like. We tried to do a lot of homework, and we were asked to do a lot of homework from track 1, which was, for me, more like wasting time. Like we had to organize ourselves. Like, for example, they would ask us, how are the modalities of civil society participation in the peace talks, Like we can be there as experts, we can be on the table, but all the modalities. Like we needed to organize ourselves. We need to do a lot of work, but still we were learning. So I thought it was like not being responsible from like more like policymakers and then decision making. And we were also working more what we call like track 1.5, which is between civil society and this track 1. We tried to create also, which is missing, and I think it's still that, to create these feedback channels. So I went to Geneva, like I need to explain what's happening. I need to also educate NGOs and Syrian people that are literally bombed. It is about their lives. They need to know that what's happening and to see how they can be brought to the table, their rights, their issues. So the feedback channels between these layers, it was very important for us. We organized so many like conferences between NGOs, or like people from the opposition delegation. Of course, we couldn't, like we were not in contact with the regime. So we try to make this connection, and I still think it is missing.
What do you see as your biggest achievement?
My biggest achievement? Like you start with a question of the change. I think I didn't change. My values and my right to exist, and then the voice I represent did not change. And it is like again about survival. Like it's just surviving as you are. And that's the biggest important thing. Who need to change is the perpetrator. They need to go, they need to be accountable. And so my biggest achievement is that in few years, I did my best. And I always say, if I die today, I have no regrets, because I did the most, and because I was there, and I saw how complicated they make it. Everything is clear. There are even evidence that was presented, and so I think I feel honored that I was there. And it made me also realize that I need to take some time, because I am,
and then I worked. A retired activist,
yes,
right? Yeah.
But I am not a retired activist.
Okay.
It sounds like I will never retire. It's more like I retire this system, because the way it's created, all the bureaucracy and all the processes and all the question and homework they give us back as a civil activist. This is not working. And I retired from a system that is incubating and holding such a dictatorship. So this is the system I retire from, but I never retire from asking for civil society and women participation. And I just want to mention, in particular about women, because you asked about it. We worked on following the Security Council Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, that, assures that women should be involved in peace building and, conflict resolution, and they should be protected, because there is a lot of gender-based violence and, violation against women during the conflict. So I was also proud to be as a woman there and as an advocate for women participation, because as a civil society and women to be there, that's, I think, at least who can talk about civilians and people, not about political gain and then it's like not taking a side, only taking the side of the civilians. And as Syrian women, I think that's worth to mention that after 3-4 years, like in 2016. I think it was around 4 in Geneva, the special envoys back then de Mistura asked us because we formed what was called back then Syrian Women Initiative for Peace and Democracy, and then he asked us to form the Women Advisory Body. So he asked to form an advisory body from Syrian women activists to the special envoy about the Syrian peace talks. And then a few months later, there was what they called a civil society room. And I think about the women advisory body, that's the first time happened in any peace talks. So, we don't need to go to how much we did as women or how quality it was, but it's more
the fact
like
that you were there.
That the fact that I was there writing the referendum paper of this women advisory body, and it was heavy, and it was important to be part of that, and it was also important for Syrian women to have such a voice there, and I hope that at some point this will flourish to a peaceful future for Syria, because we are still. People are dying, violations are being committed, people are scattered all over. Me and my family, we live in 3 European countries, that's a very simple example. And I consider myself I did not see, or I was not victimized as so many people. There are horrible stories, even more.
We will continue about the situation now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Κι εγώ με και σιγό λιώνω και για σένα μαραζώνω. Αχ, τι καημός. Μίλησέ μου δυο λογάκια, χάρισέ μου. Αχ, ο φτώχος. Σ' αγαπώ ως κανένας άλλος. Στην καρδιά μου ρίζος έρωτας μεγάλος. Σ' αγαπώ ως κανένας άλλος. Στην καρδιά μου ρίζος έρωτας μεγάλος. ماني سنة يا حبيبي ماني سنة يا ناسينا مني دنا يا حبيبي مني دنا Σ' αγαπώ ως κανένας άλλος. Στην καρδιά μου ριζώσε έρωτας μεγάλος. Σ' αγαπώ ως κανένας άλλος. Στην καρδιά μου ρίζος έρωτας Αμήν. αγαπώ, σ' αγαπώ πως κανένας άλλος. Στην καρδιά μου ριζώσε έρωτας μεγάλος. Σ' αγαπώ πως κανένας άλλος. Στην καρδιά μου ριζώσε έρωτας μεγάλος.
So Sherwan, we asked you, I don't know how often you call your mother, you don't have to share that with us, but if you would call her this week and ask her like what she thinks is important, you know, to tell the Dutch audience about the current situation in Syria, and then maybe also as a follow-up question, can you say something about Syria, or is it maybe very different per region, you know, what the situation in Syria is?
Definitely. As Ugur said, actually Syria is now divided to different colors, but actually the misery is still one. The misery is still the same in everywhere. Now, especially with the inflation and bad economical situation after the American sanctions, I think before the conflict, $1 was 50 Syrian pounds.
Yeah.
Is now 4,500, more or less.
Yeah, it's
so you
enormous.
Exactly. I mean, everything. I mean, now when I was talking to my mom, actually, one of the first things she said the unclearness and the vagueness of tomorrow, what will happen and when this will end. She said like she didn't have the chance to study, to be educated. My mom, when she was a child, there were no enough schools in northeast Syria, in what we call in the remote provinces, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Al-Hasake. All these areas were actually remote from basic services even before the conflict. So what she said, like my main investments was my children. I grow them, I spend all my time and all my energy to raise them, and now they are away from me. And after my father's death, she's sitting alone because my only brother, the youngest one, is now serving obligatory military service. So actually she's sitting alone in an area, and I asked her, luckily one of her brothers is living nearby, so I asked her, please, at evenings, if she can not sleep alone, if she can go to sleep somewhere else. And one day she came back a few months ago, she was coming back and she realized that the door was broken and people actually get whatever value they could find in the house. So I mean, old lady living alone in northeast Syria, I mean, of course, she's one of the easiest target for that. So the main thing was the unclearness and the vagueness of what's happening tomorrow. The bad economical situation, people cannot afford food. Fortunately and luckily, I can still send money to Iraqi Kurdistan or to Turkey, and then try to send it with friends, with family, through some of the transfer.
Is that now how most people in Syria survive, with money coming in from the diaspora? Is that so? Do you still have family in Syria?
I still have relatives,
Yeah.
and like so many people, like when they have someone outside, they can help them, you know, because in some areas, like I come from Afrin, after Turkey entered like my village since 2018, because it's on the top of a high mountain, it's a military base for Turkey. So my cousins were never able to go back. So it was difficult. And I even discussed with my dad, like, how can we help them? Even if I send them money, it will be robbed because of other militias or other people on the ground who's controlling, you know, it's difficult. And most people try to send money to people to survive inside Syria because there is no gas, there is no bread, and you see all of these, you know, scenes and photos. We've been seeing people gathering to get gas or bread while we have this corona situation. So it is very difficult to mobilize, to work, like there is basically no life almost. So I'm every day again amazed of how people, like I'm Syrian and I know people and I'm connected with stories, but I'm every day amazed of like how are people still alive, you know? Yeah. How are they living every moment? Like I'm trying to imagine what does it feel like to be there every day.
Well, we've also seen, of course, the destruction of all these huge cities. Are some places already being reconstructed? Is that?
Actually, Raqqa is one of the good examples. Maybe Puk can elaborate on that. It's one of the cities that was completely destroyed in 2017. Unfortunately, recently you can see houses are rebuilt and people are having some kind of a basic life reestablished. Some of the schools are rebuilt. MSF, our colleagues in Raqqa team and Raqqa project, they could reconstruct part of Raqqa National Hospital, because the hospital is huge, 400-bed hospital. And life is coming back normal. But the problem is, as I said, in Syria, every stage is different. Yeah. And one of the biggest problem actually is that it's never stopped. I mean, for example, yes, people after, for example, I will give an example, Raqqa. After Islamic State was driven away from that area and the current area became under control, what's so-called SDF, I mean, still, there was a bit level of stability, but unfortunately, the recent Turkish military operation that happened in 2019 pushed thousands and thousands of people from Tal Abyad, Ras Al Ain, Ain Isa, and Tal Tamr, all these areas being displaced either to Al-Hasaki province and to Raqqa. So, I mean, and as I said, the unclarity. People do not know what may happen tomorrow. Yeah. So it's very difficult to invest money or time or energy in rebuilding your life again and again and again.
Yeah. It's too scary also.
And reconstruction is not only in infrastructure, in buildings, right? I mean, you can build a hospital, but if you do not have medical doctors or nurses anymore because people had to flee, people were killed, then there's not much use of a reconstructed hospital.
Actually, I want to say something on this, because in Raqqa, after Islamic State left it, there were a lot of mines and booby traps and bombs that been left behind, and it's one of the strategy on one of the way to delay the return of civilians and the return of life into the area. And you can see the resilience of Syrians that I mean, all organizations, and we're pushing the coalition and to push the deminers or demining organizations to come and demine the city. And that took a bit of time. Then you saw people, see how much people are in need. They were taking, like, I think, 5,000 Syrian pounds at that time. I don't know how much it was costing at that time. I think maybe $6 to $10 US, and they will demine your house. Yeah. So people will risk their life, they will enter to the house, they will remove all the rubbles, and maybe there will be a bomb here and there. But people need to leave, and they have the willing of leaving.
What Sherwan is saying, to realize people were putting booby traps in houses, in fridges, in teddy bears. Yeah. And these were the people even after bombings. We the wounded care, so the trauma care maintained because of all of these booby traps, and people were still injured even after the direct fighting was stopped, and people were trying to return home and trying to rebuild.
Well, I think Assad has reclaimed that the war, that he has won the war is over. But of course, there's still also the province of Idlib, where still, can you say there's still a conflict going on? Or how would you describe the situation in Idlib?
I will say it's not only Idlib. Look, there is northeast Syria, what's so-called east of Euphrates, which consists of Manbij, Raqqa, the north of Deir ez-Zor, Al-Hasaki province, and this is under control of SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, who are in collaboration with the Americans and the coalition against ISIS. Then you have a pocket called between Ras Al Ain and Tal Abyad that is controlled by Turkey-supported Syrian National Army. Then you go to the other side, and then there is Kobani.
Do we have a map? I think within it would be
exactly.
It is. I don't know if there's a map, but
then you end up in what's so-called Euphrates Shield area, and then there is Peace Spring area. I don't know. I mean, do you want me to show it on a map?
Is there a camera on it? Which map should he take?
There is one of the map that I can share. Whatever.
I think that one.
I mean, basically, you can see.
What? Oh, your mic. Haha. Here.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so can you hear me? Is it good? Yes. Thank you. So basically, this area is under control of SDF and the coalition. Yeah. But there is this pocket that it's extended from here, from Tal Abyad to Ras Al Ain, and this area was taken in a military operation recently that was by Turkey via Syrian National Army. Then in this area you have a pocket where in 2016 the Turkish army also launched a military operation. They called it Euphrates Shield. Then this is the area of Afrin where actually our dear Nariman is from, and there was a military operation called Spring Peace. I mean, actually, this was the branch of Olive, no? The branch of Olive. Actually, the Turks are really a big fan of drama, so they used a lot of emotional names for their military operation. The Olive Branch, the Spring Peace, the Euphrates Shield. So they are a bit emotional on this area. Then you have Idlib. So the government is not controlling these areas, but also there is the problem of Daraa.
Yeah.
In this area. I mean, now recently there are a lot of movements and protests that's happening in that area. And the government will never control everything if there is no some kind of a peace agreement and transitional justice. Actually, this is one of the topics that maybe like Professor Ugur can talk about it, because transitional justice is one of the most important things that we need to focus on it for the coming period. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it made it very clear how extremely complicated and divided this is.
Indeed.
Before we go to transitional justice, and maybe also a little bit see in the future whether there are any glimpses of hope or not. Two questions. First, is MSF now? You are now still in Syria. You don't have to walk to the map again, but in what area and what can you do, and what is really frustrating that you can't do?
So MSF at the moment is mainly operating in the northern parts. Yeah. The conflict is still going on in those areas. There's many displaced. There are camps. The conditions are still very bare. If we take in the northwest, for example, some of the camps were flooded in the last months. So donations, non-food items, tents were needed again. If we look at the report of the World Food Programme, for example, they are saying that 12 million people are at the moment in need of food again. So
that is almost the whole population, right? 12 million, because
60%.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the access to healthcare at the moment is still challenging. Accessing healthcare at the moment, maintaining routine vaccinations in terms of. But I think one of the things which were mentioned a lot here on the table is also dignity and humanity. And to maintain that, because as MSF, as a medical humanitarian organization, there's only so much you can, but you can stand next to the people, and you can be able to help and to be next to them in these really difficult times. And I think that is. And one thing, more humanitarian access is needed. Access remains one of the main issues. If you look at the renewal of the UN border crossing from Yarubia, that one is closed, and that was voted against in the UN Security Resolution. And I think this type of things are essential for life-saving supplies and to come in.
Nariman, of course it has been 10 years since the Arab Revolution started, and what you hear a lot, of course, is like, the failure of these revolutions. But I've also heard a lot of criticism, like, it's so easy to just, depicture. It goes for Egypt, for Libya and for Syria. But what are your ideas and feeling? Does it feel like a failed revolution, or do you still see changes that have started that will develop into something positive?
Like, it started as a revolution, but we ended up with a more complicated conflict.
Yeah.
Now when you move to a conflict, then you need conflict resolution. You need a peace agreement to be able to start a transitional justice, a political transition in Syria towards a peaceful environment that you can start building, you can start entering the aid, and then you can start the healing process, let's say. So
but do you, for example, have the idea that, because you said there wasn't even a real civil society before the revolution started because it wasn't allowed, do you feel that there is now such thing as a civil society in Syria, although in an enormous crisis, or
of course,
is it
like,
too positive?
Well, for me, it's not a question of positivity, to be honest. Like, we had to become this because we wanted to survive, and we wanted for our country to become what we dream of, to have more rights, to have democracy, to have freedom, and just to be, you know. So to do that, we needed to build a civil society, and it is a good progress, but we cannot operate alone. A peace agreement with these international powers that are intervening, like coalition powers, they are countries like Russia and everyone, you know, and Iran, and like in Turkey, they exist in Syria, you know. So it is not only civil society or the Syrian job, it's more like an international responsibility to move towards a political transition, a peace talks. And that's the beginning, and that's the intention they should have. And what I see is, like, I met officials from big countries, you know, they say, you are responsible of the democracy in your country. Who said democracy and freedom is like a localized issue? Like, we do not live in a parallel dimension, you know, we live on the same earth. Like, now we have like a COVID pandemic, like, and we say we are all together in this. Some virus started like in China, and then we are all relevant to it. Like, why aren't we doing something about the humanity pandemic that we are facing? It is not like a separate issue. Democracy it's not, you know, separated. It's one whole body. So international community should do something, and international system and community that I mentioned earlier is incubating and making such a dictatorship survive. And if one or two or three like dictatorship like in Syria and a regime like Syria survives, and we keep, you know, and you keep adding other militias, and then it becomes like an inflammation area, then other dictatorship will be created. Imagine that we are not only talking about ending, now a new dictatorship can be born because they see it, nothing has been done to perpetrators and violators. So I think it is good that we have been through this, you know, like we learned a lot, and the learning is definitely good, but we lost a lot, and it's for me like this has to stop, and there is a way. Like I met, you know, why I'm angry about with all of these experts I met, you know, etc. They know the scenarios, they know all the possible solutions, they all know all the modalities, and they don't do the job. And they ask Syrians to only be alone with all of the suffering that we didn't create ourselves only, you know. Like, of course, some regime is Syrian, but there are, and that has to go, and that's the main, you know, perpetrator in Syria. But there are also other forces that came to Syria. Like, these are not even Syrian, you know, and they are intervening to change, and they play the big role to change the nature of the conflict and to make it long-lasting, you know, and then to change and then to, like, we go through several phases, like you said, and then, but then this has to stop, and then they are not acting positively, you know, they say we cannot enter into that's an internal issue, but then you can come to Afrin, you can have your projects like Turkey and Russia can come, but then you cannot come with a solution. And I think it's more like it becomes like a you know, an international issue. Syria is not a Syrian issue. It's an international dilemma, an international issue, and it's linked to democracy. And I want to just say, it's also not to be positive, but to see Syria as an opportunity for this international community and for humanity to kind of reflect and do the right thing. There is an opportunity.
I want to go to Ugur because you have studied also lots of other wars and genocides. Do you also see it this way? Like, this is really a possibility for the international community to show, you know, what they could be capable of, or how they could change. What could their impact be?
Yeah, I mean, I think that each new situation, of course, is an opportunity to right the wrongs from the past, but at the same time to basically get together and to imagine a future that's better. right? But if we look at the past decades, I mean, the past decade, I mean, I definitely agree with Nariman in the year that, you know, the two ways in which this conflict has been discussed, if you walk in the street here, you ask people about Syria, then there are two major discourses. One, it's either refugees or it's about terrorism, right? And thereby, of course, we're totally detracting from the fundamental asymmetry in that country, namely the regime.
Yeah.
You know, the regime is the instigator. The regime is the structurer of the conflict. It is the lord and master of, and was and is of large segments of the Syrian society. And I think that we have kind of misread Syrians in a cynical way, especially the neighboring countries. And you know, rather than.
What do you mean by that?
By that I mean, you know, rather than imagining what could be a best possible scenario for the Syrians themselves.
Yeah.
Very normal international relations, of course, in realpolitik, every single neighboring country or regional country has pursued its own interests, right? So Turkey is one of them, Iran is one of them, Russia is one of them, Saudi Arabia, etc. So, and I think that has been exceptionally cynical. I mean, international relations is cynical, but this was exceptionally cynical because they have managed to leave the regime intact and to offer impunity to the regime, and that impunity cannot be reversed. So if you lost family members in the 2013 chemical attacks in August in Damascus, there's no way that your mind will be at ease without any form of justice or accountability for that episode, right? It's too easy to only look to the future and to not imagine what could have been done better in the past decade.
Well, I read about this in a newspaper that last week a former member of the Assad regime was convicted in Germany for crimes against humanity. He had worked in one of the torture centers. And Germany did this as a state on, I think, on human right, based on international human right law. How do you look at this action? Is it symbolic, or could it maybe be some real possibility for, you know, this justice that is so important for healing? How do you look at this case?
I mean, I think that cases such as these, and also in the Netherlands and all over Europe, of universal jurisdiction, that if you commit a war crime or a crime against humanity in Syria, you're liable here in Germany, and with certain restrictions also in the Netherlands. Well, that's all great. I mean, it is a drop in the ocean, of course. Yeah. Because most of these people who come over here, of course, are either small potatoes or they have defected, for example, in a relatively early phase of the conflict. Whereas if you look at the way in which a city like Moscow, for example, obviously under the tutelage of the Russian government, has offered a refuge for the billions that the Assad family, for example, has sluiced into a city like that, then you think, okay, you know, we are, you know, we're trying to ease the pain in an area where others are absolutely doing absolutely nothing to it. Yeah. So this is no longer a Syrian problem. Indeed, regimes such as this one, also in a historical context, cannot survive without backing from a much more powerful regime. And only once that backing subsides, then maybe something can change.
And do you see any possibilities in the near future that this backing will subside? Because if you look at very cynical for a realpolitik point of view, what's in it for Russia or Iran to change its policies?
I mean, in my opinion, of course, correct me if I'm wrong, Ugur, because you are more expert in this, but one of the things I believe, Russia for the government of Syria, United States and the coalition for the Kurds, Turkey and some of the Arab, Qatar for the opposition, they have a lot of leverage. If they put their own interest aside, and if they put even a bit, the interest of the Syrian population and the future of Syria, and if they want to have a stable neighboring country that can maintain and maybe rebuild, that's possible, I believe. Of course, they are not, and they will not, I believe so, will put their own interest aside, because, I mean, you see what Turkey did when we launched several military operations on the border because they didn't want the Kurds to take control of the north. At the same time, Russia supported the government of Syria because they didn't want to see what's so like a bit of Sunni Arab kind of a state, because Syria is a heterogeneous, but there is a majority of Sunni Arab population in that area. And the Kurds, if the Americans also push them, and they are sitting together on one table, and they can find in some kind of agreements. Of course, the agreements that will not be enough. In the Lebanese civil war, there was something they called it La Ghalib wa la Maghlub. So no one lost, no one won. And in this sense, they could sit and they could create some kind of somehow shaky stability, but a stability in Lebanon. So I hope there will be La Ghalib, La Maghlub here on the Syrian negotiation table, and those people can push their partners in the Syrian territory and they should look at their own conscience, because Syria deserves better future.
I think nobody will disagree with you on that.
Thank you.
Last two questions. First is for you, Puk, because I think today, even the news came out, or yesterday, that a staff member of MSF was killed in one of the camps in Syria. And I was just wondering, because you were telling that you're still doing a lot of work there, does this change anything on the fact that you're doing work there?
Unfortunately, it's still the reality on the ground that there's still a lot of violence. If we look in particularly, for example, in Al-Hol camp, where we are operating, more than 30 killings have been happening in the last since the beginning of the year.
Two staffers of
no.
Okay,
in the camp, the camp itself. Yeah. But just to realize that 2/3 of this camp are kids. Yeah. Right, and so we have treated a mother and a child who had been victim of violence in the camp from gunshot wounds. So it's not a safe environment. It's not a safe environment for nobody, but not for kids. And I think next to Syrian and Iraqi national people, we also see. We have people there from third national countries, and I think it is really, really important that international countries with citizens in these places are taking a responsibility to find a long-term solution for their people.
Yeah, clear. My last question is for Sherwan and Nariman. I really want to thank you to share your professional view, but also your personal stories. I can imagine it's not easy to do that. And I was just wondering, with living here, working, sometimes still there, seeing Syria on the news, what is your kind of day-to-day or everyday strategy to cope with this? Could you...
Well, it is a journey, to process. For me, I've sometimes, a Dutch woman told me, you are a woman from another world. Sometimes I look back and I was I feel, I have been through different worlds, different literally places, different cultures, it is not easy, but also it richens you, I was I went through one of the most intensive learning processes, at least the last 10 years, let's say. It's not easy. It needs a lot of meditation. It needs a lot of consultation with experts. Sometimes for me it's more take my own time, be in solitude. And doing what I did was part of also healing for me, because I knew that I did what I can. Yeah. And I was at some point burned out of that, and I needed to take distance from it. So part of coping with that is trying to work on the situation, and now is more trying to reflect and to take a distance and to see how can I be active, and how it's more I didn't surrender, it's more how can I be active into in a bigger change, maybe I said, I believe in a bigger revolution. It's not only the Syrian revolution, if the power dynamics are, and power and big powers in the world that stays like this, I see no change. So the bigger change, how can I be part of a bigger change? and just stay healthy and do a lot of meditation. Like
I really took from this conversation that you said that one of the biggest achievements was staying true to yourself in this kind of situations. And so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Sherwan, how do you deal?
For me also, like any other Syrian, I mean, I will not try to romanticize it a lot or emotionalize it, but it's not easy. It's even not easy to work because we came from an area or from area that education was giving us the basic education, but didn't give us a lot of soft skills. I mean, one of the simple things like typing on laptop or time management or critical thinking or communication skills and all of that were not taught in the schools in Syria. I mean, I remember the first time I touched a laptop was, I think, 2007. And I remember I went to the internet, to the internet cafe, where actually you have to put your ID in the door, you give it to the guy, and then you use the internet, then you get it. Or sometimes you will not get it ever if you clicked on something wrong, of course. So I went and I asked the guy, like, how can I open it? And how much is costing? He said 35 Syrian pounds. I said, okay, here is 100. Show me how to use it. And then the guy was like, sorry, you don't know how to use a laptop. I said, no. So basically, I mean, we try to build ourselves by ourselves. Also, like, I mean, we are sometimes lucky because we find correct people. We are working with correct group. But one of the biggest challenge for me, to be honest, is that my brain is 50% all the time busy what's happening inside. I will give you an example. 2 days ago, I was working in one of the meetings, and then suddenly I received a call from my mom, and she said, your sister and your brother-in-law had a car accident. One military car kicked, bumped into their car in Derek in northeast Syria, and they are in the hospital. I mean, how come I will go in that meeting again, and I will try to continue that? How come I will be going to my next meeting when I call my mom, and she's crying and she's telling me, I can't go to be with her. I can't even apply for a visa for my mom. Do you know that Syrians cannot apply visa if you are inside Syria because they will, 90% of the times will apply for asylum. So even you can't get them for a visit. You know, I can't bring my mom for a visit here. So my brain is all the time with my mom, with my sister, with my brother, with my friends, and with my colleagues. And it is not easy. But I will say also that the group of people that they are surrounding me, they are amazing. They are so understanding. I know sometimes it will be very difficult to work with people like this, but they were always supportive, always helpful. And I think this was one of the things that keep me. And also I had many colleagues who are very good in mental health. I mean, we work together to support Syrian refugees. Puk is one of them. And I want to say actually, so there is a colleague called Minia and Sinam. They were all the time calling me and giving me techniques, you know, like breathing techniques, about basic meditation and all of that, to be able to control yourself at this peak moment. But I am very privileged to be here. I'm very privileged that I had the education that brought me to MSF, that brought me to the Netherlands. I live in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I live in Amsterdam, in West. I work with Doctors Without Borders. I'm really happy that my bread is coming from this kind of work. I have income. I have roof on my head. I'm really happy. I'm really happy to be alive. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So when your mother said that her children are her biggest investment, it also came out because you're doing what you're doing, right?
Indeed. And also I just hope from my side that I can also pay her back, not only with emotions and phone calls and a bit of euros, but also more to be beside her, or at least to bring her to me. Or there will be a bit of peace, then we can be together in somewhere else. Yeah.
I really wish that for you and your family. Thank you, Sherwan. Thank you, Puk. Thank you, Nariman. And thank you, Ugur, for this conversation.
I'd like to thank you all, like really thank you so much, and thanks to all the people who contributed to this event. And actually just to add, for me it has never been a conflict. It's just a revolution, and it's really a beautiful thing, but it has been murdered, and the murder is really clear, and they are still right there. They're standing with their knife, and nobody is doing anything except these beautiful people, who is fighting every day, individually, and I really love that. Thank you so much.
قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وشمال الحيل زعلان بس رود علي قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وشمال الحيل زعلان بس رود علي ولسلطان انت سلطان واجمل هديه قلبي حبك من زمان يا الغالي علي سلطان انت سلطان واجمل هديه قلبي حبك من زمان يا الغالي علي قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وشمال الحيل زعلان مسرود علي قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وشمال الحيل زعلان بسرود علي سلطان انت سلطان واجمل هديه قلبي حبك من زمان يا الغالي علي سلطان انت سلطان واجمل هديه قلبي حبك من زمان يا الغالي علي غصب عن المحتلين نرجع يا يوم واحب راسك وليدين وارتاح باللم غصب عن المحتلين نرجع يا يوم واحب راسك وليدين وارتاح باللمة تلفان انا بدونيش وانتي لي دوايا مشتاق والله الملقاش لبست الصايم تلفان انا بدونيش وانتي لي دوايا مشتاق والله الملقاش لبست الصايم قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وشمال الحيل زعلان مسرود علي قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وساهر نجم السهل فنجان والدل واقعد قبال ابويا نتحاجى ونتسلى وساهر نجم السهل فنجان والدل واقعد قبال ابويا نتحاجى ونتسلى واحكي له على صار وجروحي والعله غربة تخنق روحي ما اريدها والله واحكي له على صار وجروحي والعله غربة تخنق روحي ما اريدها والله قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي وشمال الحيل زعلان مسرود علي قربان قلبي قربان يا نور عيناي